Welcome back. We are in the home stretch of the social psychology module, and we are here to talk about conformity, obedience, and through understanding some of the most classic research in all of psychology. So conformity, a concept of great interest to us. What does it take to make people go along with the crowd? Why do people conform to the behaviors and actions of other people, A, if they don't believe in those actions, and B, if they don't even understand what actions are being taken? Why conform, and what role does it play in society? So these were questions that Solomon Asch had been very curious about in his research in many, I think it was in the 1950s. So Solomon Asch's research basically lined up a group of supposedly research participants, when in reality, out of the 6 people that were sitting in the research room, only one of them was an actual person being experimented on, a participant, and the 5 others were what we call confederates. They were in on the secret, they were in on the experiment. And what they were told to do was to look at these set of lines right here. And they were told to look at the first line all the way on the other side and compare that line to the practice lines in the second box and indicate which line matches the original stimulus line. And the first round would occur and everyone would give the correct answer. So in this case, if the answer is C, everyone would say C, 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 C. After 2 or 3 rounds of where everyone agreed, and the actual participant was feeling good, okay, we're all on the same page, Asch instructed the Confederates to change their answer to an obviously wrong answer. And so they would be asked, which of the lines matches the stimulus line? And people would start to answer, B, B. And one by one, they would all answer B until they get to the actual research participant. And he would look around, or she would look around, and what would happen? That was the question Asch had asked. And what he found was that a very large percentage of people, somewhere around 37% of people, would actually give the incorrect answer and conform to what the Confederates were saying. And they would say B. Now, they would look awkward in the video, they would look uncomfortable, they would have that cognitive dissonance experience. I'm saying something out loud, even though I know internally it's not true, but I'm going to conform to what the group and the majority are saying. Very important research study, and it led to some other concepts that Asch wrote about, specifically the normative social influence, which is the concept whereby we conform to the group norm in order to fit in order that we should feel good, and so that we're not judged negatively by those around us. So in this way, when friends say, come on, let's go smoke a cigarette when we're only 14 years old, and the person doesn't really want to participate in that behavior, but they don't want to be left out, they don't want to be judged as not being like their friends, and so they engage in that activity, which is clearly not to their benefit or health, but they give in to that pressure. They conform. And in other occasions, there's informational social influence. And this is when people conform because they believe the group is actually competent and actually has the correct information, and that they themselves may not know any better. And so they conform to what the group is saying, particularly when the task that we're talking about is somewhat ambiguous. And Asch had an entirely different experiment to show this informational social influence. This comes into play sometimes in juries, when a person might be swayed to go along with the majority because they may believe they know better. They must have seen something in the trial that I didn't see. They got some information that I didn't understand. So that's informational social influence. Moving right along to a concept we refer to as compliance. Compliance is when we go along with the request or demand of an authority figure or of someone other than ourselves. And what leads us to comply to the demands or requests of others? Is it perhaps a desire to fit in? Maybe it's my desire to be liked, and perhaps it could be to gain information about the group that I'm in. So I'm going to comply with what you're asking of me, and maybe in a college setting when you're in the Greek life and people want you to rush for their fraternity, you might end up comply to demands that they're asking of you, even though you might normally not engage in such a behavior, because you want to be liked and you want to learn more about the group and you want to belong. And in the long run, you're willing to make these short-term sacrifices for the long-term gain. At times, this can actually be very dangerous. There is a concept known as groupthink. Groupthink is when we go along with the group, we go along with others in order to form consensus, in order to be like everybody else, even if you know you're wrong, or even if you have the sense that what the group is doing isn't the right decision. Groupthink has been implicated in the 2008 financial crisis and disaster that we experienced here in America, whereby different banks and bankers went along with what their groups were doing in terms of their practices with subprime mortgages and other such examples. An older example is the Bay of Pigs incident relating to Cuba, and in terms of how people made decisions in politics at the time. It was believed that people went along with the group in making that political decision, whereas after the fact, when people were interviewed, they reported saying, I didn't really believe in my decision. I didn't think it was the right thing to do, but the group was doing it. Two other points that I want to make here have to do with social loafing and social facilitation. How do we act when we're in a group? What do we do when I'm the individual among many people and they are putting effort forward into an activity? Well, sometimes I might, let's say, be in a classroom and a teacher asks a question. I know the answer, but I don't want to raise my hand because I think someone else is going to do it. So I'm going to be a loafer, a social loafer. I'm going to wait for everyone else to raise their hand and participate. I'm going to depend on the group to take care of the problem, and I'm just going to sit back. Or maybe I am in a tug of war where I'm pulling a rope. And if I'm alone playing that tug of war game, I'm going to actually put a lot of effort in to pull that rope. But if I'm joined by 10 other people, the amount of energy I put in is going to be relatively less than if I was doing it alone. That is another example of social loafing. Letting go of my exertion or contribution because I think other people will toe the line. Then we have social facilitation, which is when being among a social group actually facilitates me to step up my game and perform even better than I would. So the example is used in a sports setting. A person who is sitting taking free throws and there's no one in the audience may actually not perform as well than when the crowd is cheering them on and giving them the energy to perform as best as they can. So that's an example of social facilitation. Okay. Let's turn to the last of the topics, obedience. What brings people to actually obey the demands of others? It goes beyond just complying and goes beyond just joining others. How do we explain when people are overly obedient to a authority figure when what they're being obedient towards is something they should likely not be engaging in? This question was raised by Stanley Milgram in his research following World War II and Nazi Germany, when he was really shocked at how people living in the areas where the Nazis were engaging in their atrocities, how did they just sit back and be silent? How were they so quiet? and in certain cases even comply with what was happening. So this led Milgram to want to understand obedience and as well as conformity. So he conducted an experiment that involved using a machine that, in theory, distributed shocks to a research participant. In reality, the research participant receiving the shocks was also a Confederate. They were in on the research study, and in reality, they weren't being given the shock. The person who was administering the shock was the one being experimented on, and the people were average professionals living in the area around where Milgram conducted his research study. And when they would sit down, they would be told by a man in a white lab coat that they are to administer a shock if the person on the other side of the wall answered a question incorrectly. The question was a memory matching game. They were supposed to remember a pair of words. So if the pair of words is cat light, and then you tell them cat, they're supposed to answer light. If they answer the word incorrectly, they receive a shock. And the shock is administered from 0 volts all the way up to 450 volts. And on the machine, it says extreme danger. XXX extreme danger. In theory, this can kill somebody. And the participants would then one by one ask questions, and if the person got it wrong, they were to administer a shock. And the man in the white lab coat would tell them, please continue, you must administer the shock. You must obey what I'm telling you. And when the person would say, I don't understand, that person is yelling as I give a shock, the man in the lab coat would say, that's okay, I'm responsible, you continue. Out of all of the participants, you would be surprised to learn how many administered the full 450 volts. When asked by a group of psychiatrists at the time how many people did they think would go all the way up to 450 volts, they said nobody. Or at most, under 5% of people would administer 450 extreme volts shock danger. The study was conducted, and nearly 63% of participants went all the way up, as you can see in this graph, to the extreme shock 450 volts. Even furthermore, 100% of the participants went up to 135 volts, which is already in a danger zone. So from this study, Milgram understood that we are susceptible to obedience. And there are several factors by which we achieve this state of obedience. So he learned that when people are directly in front of the researcher in the white lab coat, they will follow the instructions. But if that person takes off the lab coat and they look like they're dressed ordinarily, that might reduce obedience. Furthermore, if they could see the person receiving the shock, that would reduce the obedience. Also, if they were told that it was their responsibility, they would reduce the shock level. So there are many different factors that went into play here that might reduce the obedience level. And this study itself was seminal and very much one of the most important studies to be conducted in research. It also was criticized for ethical issues because Milgram actually caused a lot of discomfort and dissonance in his participants and didn't quite do enough to alleviate that dissonance. So that about covers our review of social psychology. I encourage you to go back into the topics, review them, use the printed material and the study questions to really get through this material and be prepared for the CLEP exam. We will be reviewing one more topic, and that should take us through the full exam. So again, drink of water, relax, stretch, and we'll see you in the 13th topic.